one that's more appropriate, but I think it's useful to start thinking about this framework. So when we start thinking about sustainability, we want to make sure that whatever goals we're setting are really big picture, not just what credits we can achieve in a rating system, but we want to really understand what's important to the client and the project and what supports the bigger picture goals we have in our office, which in our case is being signatories to the 2030 Challenge, the AA Materials Pledge, and the Lighting Advocacy Letter. So we really want to understand these big picture sustainability goals, and that's what these frameworks allow us to do. So when we're setting goals, we're talking about human health, climate health, ecosystem health, circular economy, social health, and equity. And these are all really important topics and could all be a presentation unto themselves. But today we're really going to be thinking about climate health and embodied carbon. So when we're talking about climate health, we really want to be thinking about preferring products that reduce embodied carbon emissions and are ultimately moving towards sequestering carbon. So not only are we having a less negative impact, we're having a positive impact with our designs, which I think is a really exciting place to be. So when we're thinking about this embodied carbon, we need to expand our thinking to consider the full life cycle impact. I think often we really focus on this use phase. How are the end users of our building going to interact with our designs? But we really need to consider the full impact of our choices through the whole life cycle, right from the point of extracting the raw material through the end of life and hopefully through reuse and disassembly and remanufacturing. We really, we need to consider the health, the human health, and the environmental impacts of every one of these stages, because something that could have no negative impacts for our end users could have really horrible ramifications somewhere else in the supply chain. So I think this big picture thinking can really help us. So I've been talking about embodied carbon, but before we get too far into that, I want to just mention that when I say carbon, I'm talking about carbon dioxide equivalents, which is all of the greenhouse gases normalized to a carbon equivalent. So you might see this as CO2e, or you might see this as global warming potential when you're looking for this information. I also want to show this diagram, which shows the typical phases of a life cycle assessment, because I think this is really important background information to have. So this is starting at the product stage, construction phase, the use stage, which I think we're all really used to thinking about, the end of life stage, and then this phase D beyond the building. So there's a lot of information here, but what I'd really like to emphasize is that every point along this assessment, no matter what your role is or which phase you're interacting with, you have levers when it comes to reducing the embodied carbon. So I think this is a really diverse group coming at this from different manufacturers, and everyone has something that they can contribute. Manufacturers can think about the materials they're putting into their product. People on the contractor side can think about how those products are getting to site. Architects or designers can think about the layouts. So we all have a role to play. And I think that's really important, that every member of the project team and everyone all along that complex lighting supply chain that everyone had a lot of thoughts on really feels invested in this and understands what they're doing and how it's sort of adding up into this bigger picture. So then I'd like to show you a couple material transparency labels. So these are sorted to align with the 5 buckets that I showed at the beginning. And you can see that there are a couple labels here that reference climate health. So some of these have more or less information. For example, a declare label might primarily be talking about material health, but you might occasionally see some embodied carbon info. So I just wanted to let you know there is a range of standards, and you want to consider what's most appropriate for your project. But when we're talking about embodied carbon, really what we're primarily asking for is environmental product declarations, or EPDs. So this is an unofficial poll, but has anyone used EPDs or asked for EPDs on their project? Is this something that people are familiar with? A couple people, which is exciting. So for those of you who haven't done a deep dive into this, you get 6 main pieces of information related to the environmental impacts of your product. So you're looking at abiotic depletion, which is the depletion of non-living resources such as fossil fuels, peat, and clay. You're looking at the acidification potential, which looks at measuring the decrease in the pH of rainwater and fog, which can have very detrimental impacts on ecosystems. You can look at the eutrophication potential, which is increased plant growth in aquatic environments, which is linked to having additional nutrients in those areas, such as those from fertilizer runoff. We're going to look at global warming potential, which gives you a metric related to the heat absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and photochemical ozone creation potential, which quantifies the relative impact of volatile organic compounds, which are creating low-level ozone. So when we're talking about embodied carbon, the number we're really targeting is the global warming potential. So EPDs, can take a number of different forms. They can look a little bit different visually, but these are really the data that you're going to be getting from that document. So now we know what an EPD is. I'd like to talk about why are we asking for EPDs. And I think when you're starting this process, it's really important to talk about the why, because this can be a lot of work and it can be additive to your process to get this information, but I think it's hugely important and a very valuable thing to commit to your time to. So the first thing is having an EPD lets you make an informed decision. This is really the base level material transparency document that lets you know what the embodied carbon impact of the products you're specifying. So an EPD doesn't tell you if a product is better or worse. It's not crossing a threshold. It's just telling you this is the embodied carbon, and that lets you make decisions. And I think that's really the first important step. Once we have a good number of EPDs, it allows us to benchmark our products. Then we're at a point where we can make a comparison. And it also lets us do whole building life cycle assessment, which lets us benchmark between buildings. So I said at the beginning, we need to have metrics associated with our goals. And this benchmarking allows us to know if we are actually reducing the embodied carbon in our buildings. And without the EPD background information, that can be very hard to determine. And as a small anecdote, we're doing life cycle assessment in our office for our new projects, but we are not currently including lighting because we don't have enough background. We don't feel like we have enough access to EPDs to really do that comprehensively. There are documents that sort of give you ways to do that without EPDs, but I would love, over the next 2 years to be able to do that for every project. And then this lets us set these metric-based goals, and it lets us say we're going to reduce the embodied carbon in our lighting by 10% on this project. And that's a really exciting thing, and I hope we're going to be there in the near future. So I mentioned benchmarks a little bit. Here are some examples of whole building LCA benchmarks. So you can see in the first line, we have the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is a North American-based organization. And they've been doing fantastic work aggregating data from life cycle assessments from a number of different firms. But you'll see that they're only looking at foundation, structure, enclosure, and interiors. And then you can see there are 3 other European examples which are including a little bit more scope. So we internally have decided that we're going to use the London Energy and Transportation Initiative benchmark, which is based out of the UK but does include MEP. Because of the lack of data in this area, when you see LCA benchmarks, and this is good to watch for, they might be lower than you're expecting, but they also might only be including core and shell. And you'll see in this example here, I'm looking at the numbers for schools, but these organizations all provide this data for a number of different building types. So we're thinking this 1,000 kilogram CO2 equivalent per meter squared is our benchmark for embodied carbon. That's what we're trying to improve on. And then once we have that information, I'm trying to determine, what portion of that is really related to ultimately lighting. So we start by getting data both from the London Energy Transportation Initiative, combining it with some Carbon Leadership Forum information. And we're thinking that MEP on our school projects might be approximately 13% of the embodied carbon footprint. Then we go down 1.6% for electrical, and 1% for lighting. So these are ballpark numbers, but this is what we're using as a starting point. And I think setting a benchmark can be very complicated because we want to have perfect data. But I think we all know with the environmental issues we're facing and the time sensitivity of those problems, sometimes you just have to jump in and start doing it. And if we find out in a few years that there's better data, we can keep going back and revising this. So I would consider these living targets, but it's a really good place to start. And I think it can be hard to kind of draw that line in the sand, but it's something that we felt that we needed to do. So we're thinking 1% for lighting. That sounds like a really small part of a building when we're talking about embodied carbon. But when we're looking at our long-term embodied carbon goals, we're hoping to reduce our embodied carbon by 65% by 2030 and move towards whole life net zero for our buildings. So when we think about embodied carbon, people often talk about structure as the low-hanging fruit. We're going to be able to make big moves there, and I think that's true. We're going to have some easy wins, but if we're trying to hit these kind of embodied carbon goals, we're going to need every product that goes into our building to really be aggressive about reducing its embodied carbon. And so, we might be thinking we're looking for a 50% reduction from lighting, and that's dramatic over the next 8 years. Some of that we can do through design. We can think about our layouts. We can think about what we're optimizing on our end. But we're also going to be looking to see optimizations in our products. So while that 1% might seem small, reducing it by half or more is really aggressive. So it's an exciting point, and I think it's an exciting thing to be thinking about, and there's a lot of potential here. I think it's a fantastic design challenge, really. So we've been talking a lot about embodied carbon, and I just want to say briefly here, we do still need to be thinking about operational carbon and how those things balance each other out. So depending on where your project is, what your timeline is, I think it's worth thinking about what the embodied carbon of your grid is and how the operational and embodied carbon will balance each other out. This is one of the real reasons we want to be doing an LCA, because this balance is going to be different for every project, and you want to think about what the grid is like right now and where you see that evolving over the lifetime of your project. Then I'd just like to briefly mention some building standards that deal with material transparency. I think lighting, we often think we're going to assist with the energy credits, but I'd love for people to expand that and think, are there other points that we could be assisting projects getting around embodied carbon, around material health, around interior quality. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And I've mentioned a couple of standards, but I just want to say there are a huge number of resources, and even this isn't comprehensive. So if this topic is something you're interested in, I encourage you to think about what's going to be most appropriate for your project, because there is certainly no universal answer here. And then I'd just like to briefly say, why are we talking about this in lighting? I think we had this huge win with LEDs and energy consumption being reduced. But other, building products have now taken on embodied carbon and material health, social health and equity in the supply chain. And I don't want lighting to get left behind this sort of wave of sustainability. So I think we're at this really important point. Everyone here in this room can kind of take this on and be on the ground floor in this really